Right.
I shall start.
Thank you.
So, look, thanks so much for having me. I've been a development professional for almost 20 years. At the beginning of my career, I spent 10 years in program management and country director roles for small and mid-sized INGOs, living and working mainly in rural Africa. In the last 10 years of my career, I've been based in the UK, working in executive leadership roles, including as CEO and extensively for SCDO. I've led multi-million pound global programs with funders including USAID and the World Bank, and partnered with INGOs and ministries of health and education and universities like Harvard and Oxford. I was also part of the UK Aid Management Consortium, where, owing to my experience, I had particular responsibility for working with the smaller organizations, often supporting them through their first piece of institutional funding. Now, I think all of this background is important just for you to get a little bit of a flavor and understanding of where I'm coming from with what we're going to talk about today. So when I was in these roles, what I repeatedly saw with these organizations, especially when working with FCDO, was that the smaller organizations were being asked to produce things that they were not yet equipped to deal with. So log frames, risk registers, inclusivity assessments, sustainability plans, with the quite patronizing implicit assumption that insisting on these requirements would force organizations to, use those awful air quote things, professionalize, in FCDO's terms, not mine. In practice, that often led smaller organizations trying to look confident about systems they were still learning to navigate. This may be familiar to all of you, but what's always struck me, though, is the gap between the resources available at the top of the system and available to smaller organizations like yourselves doing much of the day-to-day delivery, often in the more difficult geographies where the larger organizations are not based. Now, that resource gap and seeing good organizations struggle not because of their work is what led me to set up Third Way Consulting. Now, we're a small organization and we aim to help small and mid-sized organizations to professionalize with the kind of strategic support and expertise that's usually focused on much larger organizations. I provide online courses, and today's session is going to be partly taken from one of those. So if we could have the next slide, please, Janine. So we're going to start with looking at how boards can become more active partners in strategy and learning. So this session is an invitation to think differently about the roles boards can play, not as a check on progress, but as an active partner in strategy and learning. Now, I think Janine mentioned at the beginning, very much want this to be interactive. I've got the first 15, 20 minutes to hopefully not bore you too much with the presentation. But if there's at any point you have any suggestions, questions, bits you want to chime in with, ultimately it's about having a conversation. So don't sit on ceremony, put the hand button up. If I miss that, just start talking and we'll get to you. But before I get into this, I just want to acknowledge something that everyone here probably already knows. Having worked in the sector for a long time, I've seen really excellent boards and very difficult ones, strong trustees and less effective ones. How organizations recruit, support, and refresh boards matter enormously, including questions of diversity, representation, lived experience, and equity. But those are all much bigger conversations than we have time for today, sadly. We also have to note that these problems are perhaps more compounded now as it's getting even more and more difficult to recruit board members. It can sometimes feel like being managed by people that don't understand the sector, but it can and in fact should be an effective space to bounce ideas and strategic decisions around with. We have to acknowledge all of this whilst also understanding that as executives, there are things we can do to encourage the proper function of a board. Rather than trying to solve everything, I want to focus today on a few easy, practical levers that executive and senior leaders can use if the relationship with a board starts to feel overly focused on oversight rather than support. And while I'll be speaking mainly from an executive perspective, trustees, if there are any trustees on the call, can equally ask for these changes. These levers work in both directions. They're not one-dimensional. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Janine. So the problem, boards often default to compliance and oversight, not because they want to, because executive teams unintentionally structure board interactions around assurance rather than strategic thinking and learning. Look, over the course of my career, this is the key problem in my experience. The problem isn't that boards want to focus on compliance. Most trustees join because they care about mission and impact. The difficulty is that the system, funders, the regulators, the reporting expectations push meetings towards assurance. And executive teams, often under pressure, structure agendas and papers around demonstrating control rather than inviting strategic judgment. So the question becomes, are we setting the agenda or are we reacting to it? Now, you can think of it as a simple contrast. On the one side, the board acts as a checker. Is this compliant? In another mode, the board acts as a partner. What decisions are we helping you think through? So the structure of these meetings determine which modes dominate. Is everyone following so far? Any questions? Am I talking too fast? Sometimes I have a habit to do that. I'm really trying to slow my voice down. So I hope that's coming across. The next slide, please, Janine. So the goal of this session is to improve how an exec team engages the board so that, and this is the key, so that the board can add strategic value, strengthen learning and MEL, support better decision-making and decision-making processes, and avoid defaulting to compliance only oversight. The next slide, please, Janine. So I want to pause on this one a second, as this is the core idea of the session, really. This is the anchor of our thinking and is what I want you to take away, as I think this is the most useful thing, or certainly has been the most useful thing to me over the course of my career. So if we go through this, boards don't become partners by being told to. They become partners when the exec team designs the relationship, the agenda, the questions, the information, the rhythm and the decision architecture. And so, think about it yourselves. How was your last board meeting? Did the board default to oversight because we didn't give it something more strategic to do? And we'll have time to discuss this at the end. So what are we going to go through? So what we're going to go through now, as I said, are 3 easy levers to help develop this source of partnership. And if you see that this partnership's happening already, that's great, but it is still something you've got to be aware of maintaining. It doesn't just continue to work like that. So these levers can also be considered even if this relationship already exists between the management team and the board. So the next slide, please, Janine. So as I said, these 3 simple levers are very easy changes that can be made to help change that relationship and start to engage with boards as partners. Lever 1, agenda design. Lever 2 is decision framing. Lever 3 is MEL as sense making. Now, if they don't make any sense now, that's fine. We're going to go through each of those next with a little bit more focus on the third one, as I think it is firstly the most interesting, and also as MEL has wider impact for smaller organizations. So next slide, please. Lever 1 is agenda design. Most boards, they're not disengaged. They're overstructured and focused on transaction. If the agenda is crowded with updates, compliance items, and approvals, the meetings become a series of administrative checkpoints. By the time you reach anything strategic, there's little time or there's little energy left. If we want boards to think with us rather than simply approve or challenge us, we have to design agendas that allow for that. Very obviously, fewer items equals more time for each item. In my experience, a limit of 6 agenda items is ideal. I find that meetings tend to get saturated after that. You may think differently. That's not a hard and fast rule. And you may have got different experiences, but I work around 6. Second point, one clearly framed strategic question per meeting can completely change the quality of discussion in the room. It should, of course, be relevant. And I've just got a few examples here. Are we clear on the problem we're actually trying to solve? We don't want that mission creep to begin happening, especially happens at the moment when people are chasing smaller pots of funding and you have to kind of diversify your intention in order to raise funds from more various pots. Secondly, what risks are we prepared to tolerate in pursuing this funding? And thirdly, what would we stop doing if this doesn't work? The last point, it also helps to be explicit about the mode of each item on the agenda. Is this for information? Is it for discussion? Is it for decision? When this isn't clear, executives tend to perform and boards tend to interrogate. When it is clear, the room relaxes and thinking improves. The agenda is, it's not just a schedule, it's got to be the architecture for the meeting. If the agenda is transactional, the board will be too. If the agenda invites judgment and shared reflection, the board is far more likely to behave as a genuine partner. Now, I've got a little note at the bottom here. There's quite a lot on that first lever. But if you take anything away from it, I think it can be summed up by remembering just one simple point. If the agenda is transactional, the board will be too. Next slide, please, Janine. So the next lever is decision framing. Boards struggle, and we mentioned a little bit of this just before, when decisions are presented in a way that makes real engagement difficult. Papers can arrive dense with information, background, and updates, but it's not always clear what the board is actually being asked to decide. For every substantive item, I think 3 questions should be explicitly answered. First, what decision are we asking the board to make? Not generally, but very specifically. Second, what are the real options? Not just the preferred option, dressed up as something to give the board a choice, but the genuine alternatives, including doing nothing. Now, we have a propensity, especially in smaller organizations that are a bit more cash strapped, to think that we've always got to be moving, we've always got to be doing things. Sometimes the best decision absolutely is to do nothing or to row back. And I feel that that's something that needs to be engaged with more at a board level to get them to understand that that is a viable option. And third, what are we uncertain about? What assumptions are we making? What might not work? And what are the risks that we cannot fully control? Now, the reason that last question matters is that boards don't become partners when everything is presented as certainty. They become partners when uncertainty is visible. When executive teams highlight their doubts openly, trustees are invited into a supporting role and to become part of the solution. That shift from presenting conclusions to framing choices changes the tone of the relationship. It moves the board from oversight at the end of the process to shared responsibility within the process. And the next slide, please, Jenny. So this is the one that's a little bit denser, I think. So MEL is sense making. For those less familiar, the term MEL stands for monitoring, evaluating, and learning. Essentially, it's the systems that organizations use to track what they're doing, understand what difference it's making, and reflect on what needs to change. For small and mid-sized charities, MEL often arrives for the first time as a funding requirement. It's something you're told you need in order to secure or retain support. Many of you may have experienced this already, and I certainly did at UKAID, as I mentioned at the introduction. Funders want to see indicators and reporting frameworks and log frames, and I can understand why. You know, they need assurances that money is being used well and that outcomes are being tracked. But for smaller organizations, MEL can quickly become, or seem to be, simply compliance driven. It becomes about producing the right numbers in the right format at the right time. And when that happens, something important gets lost. The idea that MEL is not just about measurement, it's about judgment. It's about understanding what is actually happening in your programs and what that should mean for you and how you move forward. And this is where boards become crucial. We said earlier, boards are not necessarily made up of development specialists. Trustees often come from finance and law and business and education or any other sectors. And I've seen considerable resistance to MEL in some boardrooms. Sometimes it's seen as jargon heavy, bureaucratic, or overly technical. And to be honest, you know, I understand that reaction. MEL is far from a perfect system, but it is increasingly a requirement if you want to grow. And boards are ultimately responsible for strategy, risk, and accountability. If MEL only appears in board meeting as a set of indicators, maybe the classic RAG rating, red, amber, green ratings, then trustees are reduced to passive recipients of information. But if MEL is framed as insights and as interpretations, then boards can do what they are actually there to do, help the organization think. That's what I mean with this lever as MEL as sense making. Instead of bringing a long list of indicators to the board, bring insights. Rather than data points, these could be, what are we seeing? What patterns are emerging? what assumptions are being challenged, and then crucially, link those insights to one or more implications for strategy. And I've got a little example here of exactly this thing working. In one of the organizations I worked for, we used to bring a long, data heavy MEL report to each board meeting, pages of indicators, those RAG ratings I just mentioned. It often led to detailed questioning of the data and the data collection process, which was compounded by the fact that there was no one on the board that was a data collecting expert. So the conversations fell into a sort of, undergraduate research class discussion, which wasn't helpful for anyone. So later we shifted to bringing these insights from what we were seeing and presented the implication for strategy, just as I mentioned. Straight away, instead of asking, why is this metric amber or why is this metric underperforming, the trustees began asking things like, what does this tell us about the program design? That changed the nature of the conversation completely. And actually, this is just as important, it equipped the trustees with a far richer comprehension of the work they were accountable for. And so, of course, MEL is in itself a huge area of our work and the industry we work in. I just want to acknowledge here that we've barely scratched the surface. My intention today isn't to reduce it or to oversimplify it. It's simply to suggest that at board level, MEL works best when it's framed as a tool for sense making rather than as a technical reporting exercise. There are far more detailed questions about methodology, indicators, evaluation design, and evidence standards, and all of those matter greatly. But if boards can remember one thing, it's this: MEL should ultimately help the organization make better decisions. If it isn't shaping judgment, then something in that chain is being lost. The next slide, please, Janine. Okay, so that is the end. We've looked at, just as a rundown, we've looked at 3 practical levers: agenda design, decision framing, and using MEL as sense making. None of these are complicated in theory, but in practice, they can be surprisingly difficult to implement, particularly in small organizations operating under severe pressure. Standard management and communication issues or personality types, those are all things we haven't even had time to delve into today, but you'll all know them from experiences of managing up or down. But I would really value hearing your thoughts on any of what we've discussed today. Does any of it resonate? Any other challenges or positives that you want to bring forward? Yeah, what tends to get in the way of the stuff we've spoken about today in reality? And also, I can't remember the makeup of the people on the call, but does this resonate from an exec or a board function perspective, depending on whether we got senior leaders or trustees in the room? So I'll give you a minute, but if anyone has anything to add, then
thank you,
start the
James.
conversation.
I'm just going to stop the recording here. So thank you. That's been brilliant, and I'm sure I've certainly got some reflections to take away from that, and particularly that last point. I think we definitely that idea of bringing insights, it's got me thinking about how I could reframe some of that information to the board. But let me just stop that.